Hello, welcome to Bradford Literature Festival. My name is Isabel Greenberg and I'm an illustrator, a writer and a comic artist. And I'm here to talk about my graphic novel Glass Town, which is all about the Brontes and their imaginary worlds that they invented during their childhood. You've probably heard of the Brontes, especially as a lot of you are from Yorkshire, but you might not know so much about their juvenilia. So juvenilia is the word we use when we're talking about the early work of an artist or a writer or a musician, I suppose. But the Brontë juvenilia is particularly remarkable. When they were children, when they were as young as 8 or 9, they started inventing imaginary worlds, and they wrote about these imaginary worlds for many years, well into their teens and 20s. And until they started writing their more famous novels. But what's remarkable about the juvenilia is that the sheer quantity of it actually takes up more page space than their later novels, which is amazing. And when I found out about the Brontë juvenilia, I just knew it would make a fantastic graphic novel. And so that's why I decided to write Glass Town. So you've probably heard of Emily, Anne, Charlotte and Branwell, but if you haven't, they are a literary family who lived in Haworth, which is not far from Keighley. So I expect some of you have even been to visit yourselves. Charlotte was the oldest, Branwell was the second oldest, and then Emily and Anne were the 2 younger siblings. And one particularly rainy, dark night, they didn't have anything to do and they were bored and their candle was burning down. And Charlotte said, let's just imagine that we each have an imaginary island. And the 4 of them began to describe what these imaginary islands would be like. And this was sort of, in many ways, the kind of one of the early sparks of the juvenilia and what it became. Another sort of famous story about its genesis centres around a box of toy soldiers that their father, Patrick, brought back from Leeds. And they were meant to be for Branwell, who was the boy, but he shared them with his sisters and each of them picked a soldier and named him, and that became their chief character. And it was these kind of sparks and early play that helped the 4 children begin this huge world building that ended up going on for years. The more I read about the juvenilia, the more exciting it became to me. And it wasn't so much the stories of the juvenilia themselves that I found inspiring, but the reasons why they invented them and how they invented them. I often think about myself as a 10-year-old, and I certainly could not have invented anything as sort of wild and amazing as what they created. And I thought a lot about why that would be, and maybe it was to do with their isolation, maybe it was to do with the fact that they only had each other. But also they were voracious readers. They read all of their father's books and they were very competitive and intelligent and they talked a lot about politics and they were fascinated by the world, but they'd never really been anywhere. And so they travelled to all these extraordinary places in their own imagination. As they grew older, Charlotte and Branwell's vision of the imaginary world began to clash with what Emily and Anne, the 2 younger siblings, were after. And I think we can all, anyone who's got a brother or sister can relate to the tension of having a bossy older sibling tell you what to do. I am an older sibling, so I know I could have been bossy to my little sister. But in the end, Emily and Anne were so furious with Charlotte and Branwell's bossiness that they broke away and formed their own imaginary world. So Charlotte and Branwell were left in Glass Town, and Emily and Anne sailed away to the imaginary kingdom of Gondal, which was a very different place. And from then on, the 2 sort of sets of siblings wrote poetry and stories and articles and essays, all set in these imaginary worlds. One of the things I was most interested in when I was writing the book was about the relationship that they seemed to have with their own creations. In this image here, I've drawn the 4 of them building building their world, and they're building it from all of the books that they've read and the stories, and so they're piling up pages and pouring lakes of ink around themselves. And I really enjoyed playing visually with this sort of idea of the children stepping in and out of their worlds. But as they grew older, when I read diary entries and letters that they'd written, it seemed to me that they were so absorbed in their world in a way that I'd never really come across before, and that for me became the central part of the book. This idea of your imaginary world becoming more appealing to you than the reality that you live in, more real to you even. So whilst the early sections of the book are about all four of the siblings, I chose in the end to focus on Charlotte. Not because she's my favourite Brontë, I like them all equally, but because she had the sort of most diaries and letters that I felt made it easier to sort of get to know her as a personality. And what I was most interested in was her relationship with two of her central characters. So the book opens with a conversation between Charlotte and Charles, who is one of the characters that she wrote most as in Glasstown. And they begin this conversation after Branwell, Emily and Anne have died, and Charlotte is the last remaining sibling. And that's another reason why I chose to focus the book around Charlotte, because it seemed to me, it seemed so sad that you could have these three fantastic comrades and creatively sort of inspiring people to work with your whole life and then sort of end up alone. And so that's why I opened the book with Charlotte. So her and her imaginary character Charles are looking back on the creation of Glasstown and reminiscing. The other character who I focus on with Charlotte is Zamorna. And Zamorna is Charles's brother, and he is this Byronic, handsome, dark, villainous character who Charlotte is extremely seduced by. And I love this idea that, you know, you would invent a character who when she writes about him, we understand that he's horrible to women, he's villainous and a cad, but she's obviously extremely entranced by him. And I found this to be very interesting. And so in the book, we see Charlotte as she goes to teach at a school, and she hates her job, and she finds the pupils very boring and the work tedious, and all she wants to do is write. And the more that she longs for this, the more her imaginary world begins to encroach on reality. And one of my favourite parts of the book is when I show Zamorna peeping out of the trunk at the end of her bed and inviting her to step into Glasstown, and she does. And at that point, the two worlds begin to collide. I get asked a lot which my favourite Brontë would be, and that is a toughie because I think that they would all be, great in very different situations. I think, who would I rather have around to dinner? Probably Anne. I think she'd be pretty good company. I think she'd be quite chill. You know, I think you could have a really nice, little hangout with her. Who would I want to go for a sort of wuthering walk with? Definitely Emily, but I wouldn't want to spend too much time with her because I think she's probably quite intense. Charlotte, I think, would be like absolutely the best if you wanted to have a long chat about your ideas. I think I would love to talk about my book with Charlotte, and what would she think of it? She'd probably hate it. Maybe she wouldn't, I don't know. All four of the Brontes really, really like drawing, so I think they probably would have liked graphic novels. Branwell, I think it's safe to say he might be the funnest one to go to the pub with. Although, I think you'd probably leave before him. He'd be there propping up the bar at the end of the night. Whereas, maybe one drink with Branwell, then home. I think Anne would be the one that I'd want to be friends with the most. But I think that they would all of them make pretty great company, and I'd love to meet them all. I brought along a few pages of my original uncoloured artwork, and the way I work is I use very soft pencils and charcoal, and each I work at double size, so the book is sort of a third of this size. After I finished the original sort of line work, I'll scan it in and colour it digitally on the computer and add in the speech balloons and the text. And I've got a font of my own handwriting so that it's really easy to drop the text in on top. So this is Charlotte and Charles standing on top of a map of Glasstown, and they are pushing the sort of characters around the map and moving the ships because a big battle is about to start. And Charlotte is sort of the orchestrator of all the action. It's her world, and she is standing there controlling everything. So these pages here are a double-page spread from the book. So you can see, and this is one of the very early, spreads where the children have first created Glasstown, and you can see the four of them standing in front of the city, and they're sort of marvelling at their own creations. And then you can see a little bottle of ink making a little ink lake, and that was a little motif I used quite often, just to sort of show that this world, sort of to give it a kind of strange, surreal sort of twist. So it didn't just feel like they were in a foreign country. They were definitely in a sort of otherworldly place. So yeah, that's Glasstown. So I'd like to set a little challenge, which is for you to invent your own imaginary island and draw a map of it. So who lives on this island? What kind of a climate does it have? Is it tropical? Is it icy? Is it an island filled with lakes or with jungles or forests? Is it a desert island? Is it an island in the middle of a lake? Is it a big island or a small island? So yeah, I'd like you to design your own island and draw a map of it, please. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my talk and that you enjoy the Literature Festival.